And so the traumatized part of me was like, okay, like we can't, like we're not going to further traumatize ourselves by trying to go tell someone who is then going to blame us for this happening in the first place. So I shoved all that down and created this narrative that was a way for me to deal with it, that I lost my virginity to two men at a party. Mm-hmm. I've since wondered, like, why in the hell didn't anyone ask me straight up, like, hey, have you been sexually assaulted? Because I was a cutter. I was, I self-harmed. And there were so many indicators that this was what was going on in my life. And nobody ever asked me. But in fairness, I don't know that I would have been able to say yes, because I was so invested in the story that I had told myself that in the midst of it, I don't know that I would have been able to say yes. I was watching this show on Netflix that was set in like a young woman's detention center. So like young women who were not yet 18. And there's a girl in there and she's just raging and, and she was just like, I don't even know what's wrong with me. I was like, man, I resonated with that so deeply because I totally understood that, that it's one of the biggest challenges of dealing in particular with young people, particularly people that are hauling around trauma or traumatic experiences, because your brain tries to protect you from them. And so there's this way in which you really don't know what the hell is going on. In my case, that would come out within about 6 months, and I was just filled with rage. And not like teenage angst, not like my mom's an asshole or whatever, not that it was like, I was filled with rage. I didn't know where to put it. I didn't have anywhere to posit it. And by this time, through skateboard culture, I was deeply immersed in the punk culture. So, going to shows and, I had crazy hair all the time. A lot of times I would just, I would shave my head. I would dye it all different colors and, and do all this. The angriest people in this already kind of like angry subculture were the skinheads, and they were at every show that I was at, and there would always be fights. There would always be a fight, and they would always have each other's backs. I think the rage and the anger in me like really resonated with that like seeks out like. And at the same time, there's this part of me that like I had this ever plummeting sense of worth or value. And so, how do you create friendships and relationships when you feel valueless? So there was this part of me that was kind of like, well, like, okay, well, like they're kind of the worst. So they've got to take me. And like, who's worse than the Nazis? So it's kind of like, they've got to take me. And so I started hanging around with them. And then eventually, it's like I would come to understand that in order to like call this, have this acceptance and the belonging and, the sort of like, substitute family sort of situation, the surrogate family, that I would have to espouse this ideology of hate, of, that I hate brown people, I hate black people, I hate Jews. I hated everyone. Like I hated everything. I hated the whole world. I hated myself. So for me, taking the hatred and the self-hatred that I felt up and projecting it out onto specific groups of people was not that difficult. And slowly, like, and part of the process of that is wearing down like your inhibitions about using racially charged language and stuff like that. And one of the primary drivers for me in that process was listening to like white supremacist music. Because as you sing along with lyrics, then it becomes easier. Your brain, takes in that information. It becomes easier for you to go ahead and use that terminology while you're singing along. And then it's easier to use them in conversation or in passing. And then it becomes easier to sort of project that out and eventually, makes it where you don't, that any of the inhibition that you had is totally gone. there's also this process that goes on because I believe now that in order to dehumanize and objectify other human beings, that you actually have to work really hard at it, that your brain actually has to work really, really hard to not identify other humans as human. And the way that this works is that as my personal worth and value and sense of worth and value continued to decrease, that at the same time, what I felt like my value was as like a body for the white supremacy movement ever increased. So my ability to perform, and use violence was ever increasing, because I felt like the more willing that I was able to give like my life and my body to the movement, that it was like somehow that would, compensate for this ever decreasing sense of worth and value that I have. And it's almost like you have to continually sort of like triple dog dare yourself to do more, greater risk-taking behaviors, to invest more of yourself, so that your brain can actively continue to adhere deeper and deeper to this ideology. It's like you are making the stakes higher all the time to make leaving harder, to make walking away more difficult, to make it so that it operates very much like a drug, where it's like what fed that in small amounts at the beginning, saying racial epithets or whatever. It's like that doesn't bring the same sort of payback anymore. And so it's like you have to continually sort of take greater and greater risks and do more and more, terrible and violent and hate-filled things. That's sort of the cycle of, and it's like when people are in that part of their allegiance and their adherence to hate or violence-based movements, they're almost untouchable. There's almost nothing that you can do. Like, you're not going to reach them at that point.
So how long did this process take from when you first started to associate yourself with this organization or this ideology until you went, no, we're a full-blown skinhead? So
like full-on Nazi.
Yeah. So how long did it, as you described?
It was probably the first part of that process was probably between like 6 months and a year. And as you sort of learn the jargon and, sort of like the nuances of the subculture and stuff like that. And at the same time, because I am who I am, that, it's like I read a lot of, I read Mein Kampf, and I read the Turner Diaries, and I read a lot of the classics of white supremacy literature and stuff. So it was like fact gathering and information gathering or whatever. But by that point, it was like my mind had been so twisted, and it was using, it was coming about this like meeting my broken and twisted needs, that it wasn't like, oh, hey, this is bullshit. Like, this is terrible. Like that was not how my brain was processing that information at that time. So it was probably about a year until I was really kind of like full on. And then I would continue to sort of escalate and, to ever increasingly risky behavior, and hate-filled behavior over the next, about 4 years or so.
Like what, for example?
Like there was a point where I was like running guns and like taking, unmarked guns and running them, selling them across the country. That there would be bigger risk-taking behaviors of flyering targeted neighborhoods and targeted audiences. And by that, like, I mean, like hanging flyers, or putting handbills under people's windshield wipers and stuff like that. There were always fights going on, whether it was like with, like anti-racists, which are now like, are now in the embodiment of like Antifa or whatever, that there was always like this, the anti-racist skinheads or the anti-racist punks that, that they were, it was just a different expression of violence.
Mhm.
That we would fight. And then by the very end, like, I mean, we would just basically look around. We would just drive around and look for, violence, whether it was through, jumping people on the street, or, eventually we would end up tear gassing a gay nightclub. And because in the life that I was living, like, we just happened to have a canister of tear gas in the car. Like, just,
of course,
because
why wouldn't you?
When you're a bunch of skinheads, that's what. But there was this process, and it's a shift even within the skinhead movement while I was in it, where on the one hand it got more militaristic, that it took on more of a paramilitary sort of expression, where the clothing changed from some of the traditional like jeans and boots and braces to BDUs and paramilitary clothing, and that there was an increasing idea of like training for the race war that was surely coming any day now. So there was that happening, and at the same time, as I was disengaging, that there was also a big push in the movement for people to like normalize that. It's like, hey, like, grow your hair out and try to assimilate into the societies around you so that you can actually enact change within the structures of society that already exist, instead of just being like street hooligans or whatever. Then it's like infiltrate military and police and and stuff like that you could take your ideology with you wherever you go, if you're willing to if you're willing to dress in, suits and ties, as opposed to dressing in boots and braces. So by the end, just before I disengaged, that I ended up, it was imminent that I was going to end up dead or in jail in the very short term.
Sorry, I just, my kid just doesn't. So let's talk about kids.
If anyone can relate, it is me.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's all right.
So you mentioned earlier in the discussion that what you were seeking is the sense of belonging and being part of a group, or really connecting with a group. So did you find that with the
experience? Yes, I did. Like, I absolutely felt a sense of like belonging and that I had this identity, and that I felt like I lacked agency in my life, that I felt, and so this was kind of like a way where it was like, okay, like, I felt completely disempowered, like on a really fundamental level. And so, that need was met. Like, I felt like I had, I was steering the course of the world and of, and sort of my own life. People a lot of times are like, well, as a woman, like, what were you doing? Like, this is a very anti-woman, ideology. Like, what were you doing? And the best way that I can phrase it so that it makes any sense was that for me, coming with this like very broken sexuality from being sexually assaulted, that I was coming into a subculture where it was almost all dudes. It was almost all guys. And so as a woman, there were always like girlfriends around and stuff, but very few were like, Chelsea'd out and had, and very few were self-identified as like skinheads. I was able to go out with anyone I wanted. Like, in mainstream culture, I was like, I didn't understand like relationships or like how to, I didn't understand like how to negotiate a lot of that. But like inside the movement, it was like I could pretty much go out with whoever I wanted, because I was one of only a handful of girls. And at the same time, this like, it's such an intensely hyper toxic masculine culture inside the extreme far right that, again, it's like broken and twisted needs that I had, that it was like that violence and willingness to use violence felt like strength, and it felt like safety. that it felt like to me that I was like, okay, well, these are people that, like can keep me safe. Even though so many of my relationships, my interpersonal relationships while I was in the movement were hyper violent. It's a movement based on objectifying and dehumanizing people perceived as weaker. So women don't fare well at all inside the movement. There's this lip service to like women are sacred vessels, bringing forth the new white nation and all this stuff, and this targeted draw to women, like looking for more traditional roles. That as we are in this modern age of trying to negotiate and find the balance between women working and having families, and that we still don't really have that figured out very well, particularly in America, where there's no there's not paid leave and there's not really support for new families and stuff. That it's like we're still really, really, really negotiating some of that. So there's this, they utilize that, the extreme far right utilizes that to target and say, hey, like, women are meant to have children and be home, and like they shouldn't be in these spaces that men are in, and that you were created to be like our helpmeets, and that they co-opt a lot of the stuff that's used by like fundamental Christians and stuff to as this way to like draw women who are obviously looking for, it's like you're looking for like safety and protection in an environment that makes sense. And so my like interpersonal relationships were just a violent disaster. Like I was in very physically and emotionally abusive relationships for most of my time inside the movement. But, the way that it works, that it's like that fed exactly my self-image of myself at that time. Like I felt worthless and valueless. And so being in those kinds of relationships completely were, feeding what I felt, what I felt about myself anyway. And so like that was, that a lot of times people are like, well, I don't even understand like how a woman would end up being in that. And so hopefully that kind of, sheds, and I'm sure that there are other experiences as well besides mine, but from talking to other women who have been radicalized into violence, that seems to be a very common piece and parcel of that. The other thing that's going on that we're only starting now to really understand, even the beginnings of the way that human brains and bodies deal with trauma and how we process trauma. And I'm very, very excited for the next, couple decades as more and more of this research is done and comes out, because I think we will have so many more skills and tools to help people to process trauma more effectively and efficiently. That when the brain is traumatized, it seems to attach more readily to like unidimensional thought, very binary styles of thinking. And my thoughts about this are that by creating a very black and white world, that your brain, which is essentially sort of injured, doesn't have to negotiate the complexity that life actually entails. That if you have this unidimensional life, that you wake up and this thing is the most important, and when you take your first breath of the day, this thing is most important, and no matter what you do, this one thing is your top priority and what you base all of your other things on. That your brain doesn't have to do the work of this thing is more important right now, and now things have shifted. Oh, and now this hour, these things are the most important. That your brain is not equipped right now to handle that. So it readily attaches itself to unidimensional living. And as people leave lifestyles that are either like hate or violence based or some other sort of unidimensional living, cults would be a very, something that is not violence or hate based. That would be a very similar sort of thing. That we have to be ever vigilant within our lives as we continue on for the rest of our lives about attaching to any sort of unidimensional living. And there's lots of ways. There's lots of things that are healthy and seen as healthy and perceived as healthy and are healthy for people for whom they're not dealing with, ongoing sort of like traumas, things like exercise or, like sports fanaticism or whatever. That it's like there can be things that are not religion is not an inherently negative thing. But the way that people like who have brains like mine, that it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to do it all the way into death. And it's going to be the only thing that I do.
One idea with another idea, basically. And just,
Yes. And now obviously there's a hierarchy of like, clearly being, a super duper intense, like religious fanatic, that's not based in violence is better than being a neo-Nazi white supremacist skinhead, right? Like, I mean, like there's this thing that's inherently bad. And then this thing, which is like, okay, maybe the way that I'm utilizing it in my personal life is bad, but it's not inflicting harm on other people, so
but the root of the problem stays the same essentially.
Yes, I know. I don't want like I'm not equating the two things, but the way that it functions in people's lives who are dealing with trauma, that it's a net negative, because I'm not allowing myself to live and lean into complexity. And so I'm hiding from dealing with the crap that I have to continue to deal with, the healing and, and the, learning and negotiating relational skills and my, being uncomfortable in my environments or, whatever it is that I have to learn to do, that all of those things are always, an allure to not have to deal with the stuff that I don't want to deal with or that I feel ill-equipped to deal with. And so it's like watching for like drug addiction and alcohol abuse and all of those things. It's like keeping ever vigilant, which I will have to do for the entirety of my life. Like I will have to continue to be vigilant that I am letting my life be messy and juggling multiple priorities. So has 7 kids. Yeah. Got that done. But, it's like letting my life be sort of messy, that is part of my healing. And this recognition of trauma and how it, and what we're learning about it is that trauma is passed on genetically through our like epigenomes and stuff. And so it's like, trying to figure out as, in my own life and then developing, programmatically dealing with people who are exiting and leaving violence and hate-based movements. It's like, okay, like how do we negate or minimize the transmission of that trauma to the next generation? How do we make ongoing meaningful amends? How do we relate to the people? How did we get there? And this is why I think it's a worthy conversation. That for me as a former neo-Nazi white supremacist, I feel like there is value in figuring out how I got there. Whether or not that correlates, which it seems to, and there is research now to support that a lot, there's so much overlap between entrances into all kinds of violence-based extremism, and it doesn't even matter what the ideology is. That a lot of the
trauma seems to be an important factor in that many times from the discussions I had as well. It's true.
I would say that it's 100% of the time, or very, very close to 100% of the time. It's just what we call trauma. Because not everyone is going to have physical abuse or whatever, that there are different kinds of ways that the brain is traumatized. And again, we're only just really kind of scratching the surface of our understanding about trauma and how the brain processes trauma. None of which is to excuse myself from the responsibility of the actions that I took or the beliefs that I espouse. I don't want anyone to walk away and think that I'm just like, oh, well, I was injured, so whatever. And that I still had choices and free choices about my actions and what I did. to myself and to other people, and
But
that I
understand the
recognize
underlying cause of all of that in hindsight.
yes, and that I recognize that I have, that I take responsibility for those, and that I have, a whole lifetime of amends to make to try to do the most good that I can and try to dismantle all of the pillars of white supremacy that I can.
Here comes the sunshine and burns away clouds like they never were.